Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and begin our Smarter Planning Process session. And I'm fortunate to be co-presenting with Keith Lenz. So in your folder, let's get out some handouts that you're going to need throughout the session. There's actually quite a number of them, and you also are going to want your glossary. So the section that is yellow, and you have that paper clipped. We're going to be jumping through several of these and using some of them simultaneously, so you want to kind of create a space where you can spread out a little bit. Hide your other things from your... So during this session, there are 3 guiding questions for this portion. And this sheet is a note sheet. And if you could keep that handy and jot down some of your thoughts as we go through this. And at the end of it, we're going to actually pull that back out and share and debrief some of your thoughts based off these 3 questions. So how can smarter planning support various curriculum planning needs? So I want you to try to make as many connections as you can when you learn about the smarter planning process, or when you go into additional depth if you already know about it, because I know that everyone has a little bit different knowledge. Think about different stakeholders. Who could use this? How could this be incorporated into talking points that maybe you would use, and with whom would you do that? So if you think about content specialists, teachers, central office administrators, principals, instructional coaches, who else? So think about all the different ways that this could be, could support other efforts. Thinking about what Aaron was talking about with trying to align things, think about how this could align with other initiatives. How is formative assessment included in the smarter planning process? So we know from our look at John Hattie's research how important formative assessment is, and that is embedded in this process, so watch for it. And the third question, what's new about smarter planning? So Keith is going to be sharing with us a revised, some guiding questions that have been revised that support the smarter planning process. And if you already have familiarity with smarter planning, take note of what do you see as different, and we'll talk about that. And you could use your highlighters if you wish to. The next document you have a bookmark. And this is just another idea of a way to share some guiding questions, so you can, we'll look at that a little bit. And then this more fluorescent yellow. These are some cliff notes, I guess is what I'm going to call them, describing the smarter planning process and making some connections with some of the key strategies that are being applied when you're using smarter planning. So we'll come back and forth with this document. And then you have working smarter, not harder. These are some really rich reflection type questions, guiding questions that Keith will be talking to us about. And then we'll have an activity, and we'll look at a smarter map. We have an article. So we have a lot of things that we're going to be including in this session. You also, in your frequently asked questions, become a SIM professional developer. There are some articles that are related to smarter planning, and so that will give you some additional reading that you'll be able to look forward to down the line. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and look at just a little bit more detail here. And I just want to, it kind of shifted around a little bit. Isn't that interesting? But you have that on your handout, what do is there. But we have our smarter planning process, and this is the word for word in your larger font here of the updated It was originally developed in 2004, and that's one of your readings that you will have in follow-up. But just a year ago, it was revised. And so this is, I think, the launch of the revised version in Virginia, and you're the first ones to see it. So that is something that we can look at. And here in the italics, that is a paraphrase or some emphasis on some of the key points that I would like you to have as a takeaway that you can use when you're using Smarter Planning with teachers and others. Okay, so let's get into steps. Switch.
Do you mind if I pull this board over here?
Not at all.
I'm all about code construction, so, and I never know quite where it's going to go. So, one of the things about smarter planning is, if I was to put S, M, A, E, R, you have to think about it as multidimensional, because smarter planning happens for a course, happens for a unit, and then is repeated at the lesson level. Okay? So not only are we thinking about a process where we think about the beginning of instruction all the way through assessment and evaluation, but we're also thinking about how that process moves from the course to the unit to lesson, because it's repeated. It's just at different levels. So for the S step, by the way, this acronym started out as Smash the Spider. And it got changed to Smarter. Smash the Spider was the original acronym for this planning process. Because in the research on teacher planning, it wasn't like teachers plan and then they're done planning and then they teach. Planning is an ongoing cognitive process. The teachers plan on their feet. They change their instructions. They change what they're doing. And so to say, okay, we're going to plan now, and now we're going to teach, it's a much more dynamic process. And so that's been why Smarter has been really kind of a fun but difficult conversation to have, because it is such a not a linear process. We'd like to say we have standards. We take the standards, and then in the Smarter planning process, what do we do? What's the first step from the standards? It leads to shaping critical questions. Now, we struggled with this for a long time. I always think of, what's the cereal with the rabbit? Tricks. You know, objectives are for teachers, questions are for kids. You know, that they always think of that, is that we have objectives in terms of what we want to accomplish, but really if we want kids to own what they're learning, we turn it into a question that they can ask themselves. Like, how do I write a great paragraph? Or how do I organize myself to write an essay that's really impressive or persuades people? And because when you ask a question, you automatically begin to answer it, right? And if you, for a course, we begin to think of broad course questions as aligned with the standards for that course. Unit questions build into supporting the course questions. And then lesson level questions do what? Lead to the support of the units, right? Lessons to units to courses. Now, and I always think of the unit questions as higher order questions that help students pull together the various relationships across a unit. So if you're talking in history about, different events and causal relationships. You're going to have how did the various events and people, what they did and decisions they make lead to the set of conflicts and this outcome. Now, you have to read the whole unit. You have to have all these lessons. You might have done comparison tables. You might have done clarifying diagrams. You might have done question exploration. But eventually, at the unit, you pulled these lesson level activities together so it makes sense, right? Eventually, then, and this is a part where we've struggled. And I don't know how in Virginia how you've accomplished this, and I have a feeling you've probably done a little bit better than many places, would be my bet. But once the course organizer, course questions are created, what happens to the course organizer? How often is it used? When is it used? And because in the smarter planning process, you have a set of course questions that are supposed to do what?
Be the roadmap for the students and what the course is based on throughout the year, so it guides our students with the thinking.
And so, in order to keep those questions alive, what do you need to do?
Keep bringing it back out and making connections
Yeah.
with the unit organizer.
And as you finish a unit, you say, all right, what information in this unit supports which course questions?
Yeah.
So, and that we find teachers giving a course organizer at the beginning of the year and not returning to the course organizer. You know, it's one of those things like, how can we fix this? You know, how can we get them to revisit, rethink? Because that is the intention, is to keep the big ideas and right in front of kids, and the standards really focus on some of those bigger ideas and bigger understandings that are course-wide. So for the S step, shape the critical questions. The questions, I would say at the lesson level, they're more, the questions at a lesson level would be characterized by what? What would you think the lesson level questions might be?
Concepts that you're teaching, get that, the skills.
Almost any of your devices, concept mastery, concept anchoring, concept comparison, the recall enhancement, are lesson level devices, right? You do it in a day, pretty much, right? It's today we're going to learn this concept. Today we're going to compare these. We are going to look at this cause and effect relationship between these things. Or it may be a 2 or 3 day, but it's a lesson level. It's not like across a whole unit, right? So they tend to be more finite. They tend to be, they can be even more on Bloom's taxonomy, recall, just understanding who was this person, things like that. Then at the unit level, how do they grow up?
Yeah, the higher level questions.
That's right. And at the course level, they're the highest level. They are broad, sweeping questions, looking for trends across the whole course. So the S step should be, or the shaping the critical questions, all about getting the students involved in discussing and having conversations about learning. I think there's a little white paper that I've been working on. You'll be the first group to see the first version, the first draft of whatever, wherever it's going.
I know.
But, you know, what I've tried to do is I've been watching teachers teach, and I've been having conversations with kids. I did over 200 interviews with kids over this past year in terms of what do they think about course organizers and unit organizers and instruction. And the goal of collaborative, co-constructed learning experiences is what kids want. And teachers struggle with handing over that student-centered instruction to be collaborative, to be co-constructed, to input, because their perception is it takes too much time and I don't have enough time to teach the content. And so that gets me off track. So there's an ongoing tension about really accomplishing this.
The
But-
students you interviewed, were they both at the middle school and the high school level?
7
See-
through 12.
Yeah, see, I think that's important to also recognize, you know, when we start thinking as our students progress into the high school and they're more likely to kind of sit at the back of the room and not participate, you know, bringing that to the forefront and be like, no, they want to co-construct, they want to be actively engaged.
You know, it's interesting. 2 years now, 2 years ago now, I visited your junior high, middle school.
Culpeper Middle
grade.
and Eastern View High School.
Yeah, it was a group of 8th graders, and that algebra class. And it was very interesting to listen to a lot of the questions that eventually wound up in my the 200 interviews emerged from some of those conversations that I had with your students there. But the evolution of kids' perception of what they really want is often that they hated it at the beginning, but as they got in, get vested in it, the whole idea of being involved in constructing became really more important to them. But these questions should facilitate that process. It should be how, why, not so much what. I work with teachers to say, well, list the blah, blah, blah. That's not a question, and that's pretty lower order. And even when I suggest that kids generate questions, they will often say, so what would be some good questions we could ask? Or do you think we're going to answer in this course? Or answer in this unit? Or that we're going to answer today in today's lesson? Where are their questions usually? Pretty lower order, right? So I usually prompt them, say, okay, I do want you to know that. You know, and then one of the things that I think is important is as we generate questions with standards, the new standards and the more higher level standards, it doesn't mean we ignore the foundational knowledge that kids need to acquire. It means that that's not all we're going to require. So we can ask pretty lower order questions as long as we ask kids, so you think that's the only question that I'm going to ask you? Don't you think I'm going to ask you to do something with that information? So co-construction of even the questions with kids will say, that's kind of a 3rd grade question. How could we make it an 8th grade question or a 9th grade question or a 12th grade question and have them integrate multiple questions into one big question? So the Shape Your Critical Questions is all about translating to standards and to the extent possible getting kids to participate in a discussion of what those questions might be. And as you were saying, it's really important to draft these ahead of time because you're the mediator, you're the guide, you're going to facilitate the direction of how these questions are going to play out, but you can use the words of kids, and you can use, and maybe even they'll think of some questions that you hadn't even thought of. So that's, you know, those are the important things that I wanted to say about the S step. But the one thing that's come apparent is you always think about your assessment at the very beginning because everything has to lead to that assessment. So developing this test, the questions, with the end in mind. What does your test look like? When an activity that I do with teachers that I think's eye-opening is I will have them bring their unit test in, and I will have them evaluate within like the pyramid which of your test questions are required or critical for all students, which questions would you be okay with most of your students, and then there are a few students who you are going to expect to get all the questions right, which questions really are for those students who can do more. So they are basically sorting out the questions in terms of level of difficulty and importance. And I think that the tests need to align with your questions.
And with that point, it's also important to recognize that the reports that we're getting on students now from the end of the year SOL test, the questions that they're getting right and the questions that they're missing also will have that ranking. Was it a low-level question? Was it a medium level? Was it a high-level question? So I think that is a great point to bring out as well.
Good connection.
The importance of doing that.
So, additions, we have a lot of professional developers who work with this, so what would you add?
I just had a thought. So on the back of the unit organizer, the self-test question, I've always had my students try to come up with a question or two that's all encompassing of the unit. That I tell them if they can answer that question, they should be able to ace the test. And that gets a really high level question, and it usually will coincide with the course question associated with the unit. So it's like a way that I've shown my students that they can think that broad picture with the material. I don't know if that's a good thing or I'm doing it incorrectly.
I think it's fine. You know, the reason why that space is there was to honor the idea that planning never ends.
Right.
That you may think these are the questions that we're going to answer this unit, but all of a sudden something comes up, some current event comes up, something happens in the school, there's something that causes a question to surface. This is not on the unit organizer, but really represents powerful, immediate, important learning. And that's a place to record it. You can also, if you get through a unit and you say, all right, and you don't have anything really there or you want to add something, what would be the big question for this unit? That's a perfect place to do that, because that's an emerging question that's probably shaped as a result of participation in the unit and could even focus on the ahas. And I think that with the new standards, that's where they want kids to go, to begin to discover insights that are new, to pose questions that aren't on a list somewhere, that we create the inquiry that's important. And so doing that, I think, fits right with that. Okay, the M. Of course, the M is my favorite. What's M? Draw a picture, relying with order, the order routine. Mapping the content. It means figuring out what are the parts of this unit visually, drawing the lines, and what do you put on the lines? And you know, and what have we learned about how difficult it is about these linking words and relationships? It's difficult. It's doggone hard, right? I've had professors at the university ask, do I really have to do this? So the answer is yes, you do. I really think that that's where the playing field or the problem space is defined. These are the chunks of content. This is the relationships that are going to be important. The kids see the connection between these things. Because looking back at that map, and the map's not the first page. It's not, on a course organizer, it's just the units, right? On a unit organizer, it's the first and second page of the unit organizer. And then on the lesson organizer, it is the subsection, the lesson. But when we do that, we become explicit. Our language becomes explicit. And for those of you who've done the unit organizer, I would say that the most important thing that I learned is when teachers teach, they teach at a surface level and they don't realize what they're saying and how kids are processing that. The kids are writing notes, and when they write notes, they were taught a long time ago not to write down the little words. And the little words are lead to, was a result of, is an example of. And if we don't put those line labels and plan that, then the kids are going to probably miss it as well. So the M step is what are the units in this course? What's the parts of this unit? And then each part of the unit could be mapped at a lesson level. Now, I don't know how you guys, I'd kind of like to ask you, how many of you actually use lesson organizers with your unit organizer or do other kind of extensions of your unit organizer as part of a map?
Lesson organizer has not been popular.
Okay?
It has felt redundant to
And-
the unit.
And Keith, we're gonna talk about that today, and that's actually part of what we're talking about, because a lot of divisions, they have a required lesson plan template that their teachers have to use. So that's another reason the lesson hasn't been utilized as much as it is.
Well, and the only reason I mention that is the extension of the space for teachers to provide more graphics or more detail in their map, and specific questions about that. I've had different plays on this. I've recommended to teachers, like math teachers especially, who have a different problem or a different operation that they want to cover every day, to break down the unit organizer, and a lesson organizer is a way of capturing that process. But I have other teachers who agree, lesson organizer is redundant, I can get it on a unit organizer, and I think it's a choice in terms of the level of organization that they're comfortable with. The point is, you've mapped out the information and it's sufficient for you to explain it. So, what have I missed on here? Oh, and I encourage teachers to draw as many circles and lines and arrows as possible to show the possible relationships within that map. You want to add anything?
And how do you do that so that it's understandable? Because I'm sitting here thinking, in professional development, we have them limit the number of bubbles and things and to chunk their information more. So, and you're saying you're encouraging them to add as many as possible. So help me work through that.
Well, in the planning process, you map it out so you're sure you understand it and explain it and the relationships are clear. When you actually then convert it and put it on a unit organizer form, then you do the consolidation. So how can I make this? Because one of the criteria is keep it simple. But that doesn't mean that the ideas are simple, because there's a document that I worked on with a group of teachers. Say, okay, you have a unit organizer, and here's you got the 7 or fewer bubbles on the first page, and then you have your map. How are you going to teach the content in the expanded unit map? And that's when they say, well, I'm going to teach some strategies, I'm going to use a concept comparison table, I'm going to use this device. So that detail can be converted to the individual or different extended teaching devices. And that's one of the things that I am a champion of, is we need to facilitate the integration of more content enhancement devices as part of the teaching process. We can't get away with just a unit organizer. That a unit organizer sets the stage, the problem space, but then we use individual teaching devices to say, okay, we're going to compare these things. And it goes, where on my unit organizer? Where would this fit? Because the map, unit organizer map is a map.
Yeah.
Where are you going to go here?
One thing we do in our school divisions that have the multiple devices is that integration, and we help them with the organization on the expanded map. Like if there's a certain area that we've included concept comparison or frame, we even have the kids highlight it or write C-frame and add that to their, we've had teachers color code, and use that, running things off different colored sheets of paper so that, the units can be kept together.
Yep. Yeah, I like the activity where we say, okay, here's a unit organizer. Where in our text is this information expanded or described? Or go to the textbook. Here's this subtopic here. Where on our unit map would it be? Because the whole idea of using it to put information in context is really what it's all about. That's why at the top of the unit organizer we have, what was the last unit? What's this unit? What's the next unit? What's the big idea to hold these together? And now, how is this information in the unit related to the other resources that we have available to us? that's one of the things with the web, that in order to use the web effectively, you have to have lots of background knowledge. You need to know where information fits in order to know where to go. And that's where, as we work with kids in a web environment, that this whole issue of context and where information fits with other information becomes really important. So the more we can do to get that context, the better off I think we'll be. The map, so the questions here. Now, which is first, really? Now, it's put like at smarter is a word, and so you think I do this first. But which is first, creating the questions or drawing the map?
I think it depends on who you are as an individual and if you want to draw first or if you want to think in terms of questions.
I think that's a perfect answer. I have mapped, I have done the questions, and then I go back to change my map, or I do the map, and then I have to revise my questions. It's really a dynamic process. The whole idea is that your questions, though, let's say at the unit level, your questions should be, if you look at the map, you should be able to get suggestions on the answers to your questions, but just by looking at the map, your questions should include keywords like compare, how are they alike and different, that are cued in those questions, those words should suggest the higher order reasoning required. And if you look at the map, those higher order reasoning kind of words are used in the line labels that reinforce. So there should be a connection between those two. And then the A step then is logically, comes right from that. What are analyze relationships? What are we doing when we analyze? I always think of the question of what makes this hard? Mm-hmm. What makes this difficult? What would challenge my kids? And what would be the list of things that you would put in that list of what makes it hard?
The complexity of the information, how it's organized, learning difficulties that, if you've been a classroom teacher for a while, that you've seen in the past, based on, is it the complexity, the abstractness of it?
Commonly confused concepts.
Yes.
Kids' background knowledge, their background experiences, and prior courses or not, is this an intro course?
And even to the level of, I have students have significant reading problems. All of those things make it hard. They can't read it. They have trouble with comprehension. They have trouble drawing conclusions. Higher reasoning that's required. The ability to extract evidence from something and not knowing the strategies for evaluating evidence. There's a lot of things could make information hard. And one of the things that makes it the hardest is there's so much. And one of our tasks is, how can I distill this to the really key critical pieces of information? And so here is where you analyze, you begin to think, what really makes this hard? Because what makes it hard means that in the R step, you reach enhancement decisions. Now, I view reach enhancement decisions as very broad, because the enhancement decisions that I would make at a course level would be, what would be, at my course, what is the broad types of thinking, the discipline-specific strategies that I am going to have to embed and teach students in order to process my discipline. For science, for social studies, for language arts, those higher level discipline-specific strategies really become important. So it means also what content enhancement routines then would be best used throughout my course. It doesn't mean that I can't use other ones, but it means at a course, big perspective level, what do I think right now? And one of the things about course planning and Smarter is planning is recursive. You're always going back and changing. You're all, oh, I have the wrong course questions, or I have to revise these things, or So it's always changing, it's always fluid. But here, in reaching enhancement decisions, I basically say, what are the routines I need? What are the strategies I need? What are the social skills that I need to teach for collaboration? And what are the accommodations that I need to make content accessible? Because all those 4 categories of things are the ways that I address the difficulties that I identified there. And this is where I pull in special education, the accommodations, who can help me here to get kids access to that information, what are the social skills that are required for collaborative group work. If I'm going to teach kids to collaboratively work on an argumentation and evaluation process, how do I get kids to be able to accept criticism and accept information and be able to evaluate evidence? So here is where I make a lot of the decisions about what kind of teaching routines, learning strategies, social skills, accommodations need to be built into the design of my course so that when I get to my unit and I have that collaborative assignment, I have that concept mastery device, I have analogical reasoning, the anchoring routine, where they're going to have to work on some of that, I have built up experiences for that. So here in the reach enhancement decisions, this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of that bag of tricks, your portfolio of instructional procedures. What are you going to use? And this is where you pull in other interventions, like the Cornell notes, or other interventions. And one of the things that I think that professional developers here have learned is you can't fight initiatives that are already present in a school. You integrate with them. How can I leverage universal design, backwards design? How can I leverage other interventions that are adopted, that are accomplishing our goals, and make teachers see that this isn't something new and different and harder, but really aligned with things I already believe in and I'm doing. Otherwise, they're probably not going to adopt it. It's got to be, you want them to adopt good practices, the practice, and I'll make this point, I believe that the cue, do, review pedagogy, which is going to talk about in a minute, represents the kind of instruction that higher level standards require, co-constructed, collaborative learning experiences. The content enhancement routines, the manuals, the pedagogy, the cue, do, review process is an exemplar of the kind of instruction we want to move to in many of our practices. And that sometimes we implement or train teachers or provide professional development with teachers and allow the procedures like content enhancement routines and this kind of pedagogy to coexist with practices that are really do not align with the standards. That are actually, they continue to promote practices that aren't collaborative. They don't help co-construction. They are actually, do not facilitate the attainment of standards. And so to the greatest extent possible, we look at content enhancement routine implementation as an exemplar and how can we move some of our less effective instruction to be more collaborative, to be more co-constructive in order to be aligned more with the kind of instruction we want to see in schools. So it should replace practices that are not aligned and then facilitate and enhance instruction that is aligned but may not be sent. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
But that's my 2 cents on the SMAR. You know, I think of my little way I think about this, and I usually get a chuckle, is S&M is the hardest. It leaves you black and blue, right? You know, it hurts. It's the thinking part. It really is. ART, the analyzing, reaching instructional decisions, the teaching is the art of instruction, the art of teaching. And evaluation and revision, that's the ER. You're in the emergency room, okay? If you've evaluated, you've done your formative assessment, you do your test, they haven't learned what was critical, then it's an emergency. You need to do triage. You need to figure out what you got to do differently, or maybe you had your wrong targets. Maybe you had the wrong questions. So I'm going to turn it over to you and
Great, thank you. All right, we're going to do some activities to get into more depth with A and R now. Okay, so we're going to look at this exercise. Think about a time when learning was hard for you. So I want everyone, without saying anything, to just try to think of what that experience might have been. Think back through your school experience as well as any other kind of learning. Okay, so for me, I want to share this example of how I took yoga for many, many years, and I really wanted to do a headstand. And I saw others in the classroom who were doing that. Just a few, not very many people actually could do a headstand. And so when I thought about, well, what would it take for me to get to that level? You know, I was a beginner in yoga, and what would be needed. So you have your experience in mind of what was hard for you, something hard. Okay. So for me, with wanting to do this headstand, I thought about, well, what is my prior knowledge? So I looked around the room, and I saw what looked like it took a lot of balance. I didn't necessarily know all of what it took until I started having some experiences that would build me up to the point of gaining the skills that I needed to do that. What was my motivation? I thought it looked like the pinnacle of yoga. Like if you could do this headstand, then that meant you had arrived in the yoga world. And so I wanted to do it just because it would be an achievement for me. Did you have opportunities to practice? Yes. At the time, before I had children, I was taking yoga classes 3 times a week. And so I had a lot of practice. And I had a lot of practice in the building blocks to it. And because what I started to learn was that I needed to have a strong core in order to do this. And that was probably my biggest weakness, is having strong stomach muscles. Fearless practice, to try and fail and try again. We had small steps. The first ones were really just like making a triangle with your body on the floor. So there was no risk of falling over, because once you're in this spot, you could really injure yourself if you fell the wrong way, injure your neck if you fell the wrong way. And then after that, we were up against the wall. So then I had that, I could go backward, I wouldn't fall that way, I could lean on the wall, or I could go forward and I knew how to roll out of it. Also the experience of being upside down. You have to build up that blood rush to your brain. And then after that, they have a stand that you can put your body in so that you're supported even in the middle of the room. So there are a lot of scaffolds in place to help practice to get to that point. My teacher, she provided so much feedback along the way, and she could sense when I was ready for the next step too, based on how I had been progressing. And she was very comforting and would let me know that things come and go. Some days are better than others. And so I had that support system. Was it clear what I needed to be successful? Along the way, it was, because I was building up those, the preparation for it became clear. So I want you to turn to a neighbor and talk about your experience of something that was difficult, and try to go through and answer some of these questions. Okay, so you'll have 2 minutes to talk with a neighbor and share back and forth.
And I really think that I lack support systems, and that's why I ended it, because when I'm young kid, they don't always give us the extra time, and hey, here's an annual, why can't you get it? So it wasn't under the plan, so I could understand how I never got a chance to switch it, big shoes to fill.
I still have this on. I'll just stand in front of it. I'm trying to think about where that would fit.
It's the Friday on R.
We're going to talk about here. Okay.
That's how I see
It comes to level of when you talk about you haven't done it.
So if you could, when we get to the, well, see, you were thinking A&R, but I was thinking that's about teaching strategically. Can you ask it on the T?
Well, yeah, because it is a one on the T.
Yeah, ask it on.
It's the A.
Right. We're going to do, well, we are going to do that, but I think if you want to put it all together, maybe save it with the T. Okay. So maybe wait just a little bit because we're going to go through. Okay.
Go back.
Okay. Okay, so time is up. So now in your handouts, you're going to have a chance to keep talking about this, but I'm going to give you another task. So look for the handout from Teachscape, Analyze and Reach, Try It. And so still keep working on the what you were thinking of as an experience that was going to be difficult. And then look through these different categories of why, what about it was creating the difficulty. So this is really just an extension of what Keith was already talking about, is looking at what makes the critical content difficult, what about the relationships. But think about that where it kind of your other experience, not necessarily about the what you're teaching in your course. And look at, is it related to content? Is it related to the materials that you were provided or had to deal with, your environment? Was it for you as a learner? Was there something, like I mentioned, I came into the situation having weaker abs than maybe other people in the yoga class. Was it that part of it, or was it the instruction? Was there something going on in that situation? So if you could continue to talk about it using this, and when we do apply this, which is perfect, what Dana was going to ask after we do this exercise, maybe this would actually be the time to ask about it, is then when you're relating this back to your critical questions and your concepts, you're asking yourself what is going to be difficult in order for them to get to that higher level of thinking to answer the question, and that's when you're building in, you're reaching your enhancement decisions and applying all the tools that you have available to you to make the learning possible. So go ahead and keep working for another 2 minutes. Go ahead.
So we were doing conference at what point did you stand and stand back and say, what makes this hard for me? What is it that I'm doing over? What is it that
I did abstractness and organization. I felt like the organization
is going to
wasn't
be
clear to me. I think it could have been very clear to other people, but
that is going to be
the complexity, it was hard to do quadratic equations. It was harder to do them with computer programming. And then quantity, it was a lot. Like you had to be able to program like 6 or 7 programs in 4 hours, and I couldn't do the first one, and I knew I couldn't. And I'm sitting there still doing that one, and knowing I'm running out of time to do the second one. It's like, why am I even doing? And then cognitive thinking, I just could not process the two things at once.
I just read the complexity and quantity.
Yeah. So that's exactly.
And I guess I wasn't sitting down with I
Couldn't think the way they wanted to think.
like nothing was working.
And that's you know, you can predict, but you would never quite predict what's going to go wrong, what you can miss. And so that's why this will be smarter. Because, well, planning is good. We're always evolving. On our feet, as we're doing it, things have to be made. Right now, and planning is not, you know, then that happened before, and now I'm doing it.
No.
I don't know
That's,
about-
I think, part of that.
I think it was probably pretty
I
but
want
see,
to
mine
see
wasn't, like, the materials for that class were
planning
not
at the
clear,
beginning,
like, it was just
Yeah,
like
not
a bunch of computer
planning
jargon.
during
They
or
never
after.
explained to me the computer jargon is not there, there's a lot of. Right, I mean, I guess they just assumed if your answer. was-
Okay, time is up.
It's really wrong. I couldn't figure it out.
Okay. So before we move forward, let's look at this briefly. So take out your fluorescent yellow, the smarter planning. And so we've really talked about shaping the critical questions, mapping the relationships as well. Analyzing and reaching really go together because you're trying to match then your enhancement decisions that will help with the areas of difficulty based on all those different possible reasons. And all of the guidebooks have a section that gives you some clues into if it is abstract, your concept's too abstract or it's a large volume of information to organize, what are some of those reasons why that routine will be a best fit for the needs in your classroom for that content. So when we look at reach enhancement decisions, you have a strata notes, and it's from 1996. So it's an old one, but when I read this, it was a part of my required readings. It's no longer a part of your required readings to become a CER professional developer. And so I wanted to share it with you because it really helped in having that conversation with teachers of why would I use the concept comparison routine? Why can't I use a Venn diagram? Thinking about like those other tools. Well, you can ask yourself some questions. Is it something that they need? And sometimes it's about the amount of time. So what this explains is the difference between a simple enhancer and a complex enhancer. So if you look at in figure 1, and it's highlighted here that you have several examples. If it's something that can be a very brief and it's still going to be memorable and understandable and it will create that for students, then maybe you don't need a content enhancement routine because that's an example of a complex enhancer. So the concept anchoring routine is another time when that's come up. If you can make an analogy of why that process is like repairing a lawnmower and you can do it with a 2-minute story, then in that moment, that isn't the right enhancement to use. But if that process, you're really trying to help the students to break it down and you want to spend that in-depth time having that dialogue with your students about it, then yes, you're going to want to have a complex enhancer. So if you think about an enhance, another idea pulled from here is that whatever you're enhancing, you want learning to be understandable and more memorable. And so that would be an overarching goal between whether it's simple or complex enhancer. So this could be a nice, very quick read. It's a short article that you might be able to pull some talking points.
You know, one of the things I would add to that, and it covers it in here, but whether it's simple or complex, you still implement it with a cue-do review type of pedagogy. It's still, you're going to tell a story and it's quick, you still have the potential of kids missing the point. And I always think of, the example I like best is, I'm going to show you a film. You know, to me, that is a teaching device that potentially could have a lot of power, but it's simple, but you cue with its purpose. You do it by stopping at different points in the film and talking about what it's saying to make the point. And then review, so as a result of watching this film, what do we know, what are we going to do, how does it change things? And I think if we begin to look at some of these moments, a lot of moments in teaching as teaching devices, with that cue-do review kind of mindset, I think we move closer to the kind of instruction that are intended by the standards to help kids reach mastery and begin weaving that process in. And using simple enhancers can be a lot of the things we do that could be made more powerful.
Mm-hmm. And it's really proactive, because when you've cued it, you're more likely to get the results that you want, and then you're reviewing it to reinforce it, so
Right.
it's good. Yes?
When you are all doing your professional development, do you hint at that cued review is research-based and that you shouldn't, it's not just for the strategies, but we need to integrate it into your practice? Do you hint at that subtly, or, because I've never heard it spoken about that way, I've just heard it in isolation.
I think some people might do that, but in general, I don't think we use content enhancement routines and that pedagogy as exemplars for how other types of practices should be used or implemented.
It seems like such an easy way to
I think
I call it, we need to be participating actively in an evolution of our practices. And in tying Q-Do review to that evolution makes this as, okay, we're going to do content enhancement routines, and there's a way we're going to do this, but as we do the routine, I want us to think of the instruction that we're using and begin to see how we can weave this into other things that we're doing. And I think that has, and because of that, I think that we haven't sustained some of our content enhancement routines because they see it as different and unique and hard because it takes more time. But actually, I think it really represents where we want to move if we want to become more powerful in our instruction, and we have to move it to some of our other things.
And that conversation definitely, for me, has come up frequently in follow-up coaching sessions, because that's part of further understanding, because Q-Do review is catchy, and so, but then you miss the instructional sequence, and that's what it represents. And so then having that conversation, saying how you can it's good teaching, so you can apply that to everything you're doing.
And with the learning strategies, also the stages of instruction, we say it's good instruction. Anytime you're teaching something, you should be describing it, having verbal practice, modeling it, all of these stages prior to ever having that expectation of students being independent learners.
And we're talking about Q-Do review, which really, that's all, ART, the art of teaching, all really goes together. So when we look at, I pulled out one particular question from the Working Smarter, Not Harder document for under Teach Strategically. So when we look at this question, I want you to tell me what are some words that come to mind that we've been talking about this week, that maybe you connect with in your own personal experiences. So does my instructional sequence include drawing students' attention to the use of a certain instructional process, involving them in the process, checking for effectiveness in that process? So try to pull out some of the key words and make some connections, and I'm curious to hear what kind of connections you make with this. Okay, so you thought of Q-Do review. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, so that would be one connection you think about when you read that question. You're thinking, well, that sounds like that represents Q-Do review. Okay. And co-construction. Mm-hmm.
Dialogue that is
Yes, yes. That interactive dialogue back and forth between the teacher and students. Mm-hmm. And you can even look at the additional questions here to see what is that all about. When we're in that interactive dialogue, we experienced it ourselves yesterday when we were co-constructing with the framing routine and had that really good dialogue about what our is about statement or so what statement. And what did that remind us of too? We thought, well, wow, that's a really good example of what else? What else have we been trying and incorporating?
learning structure.
The different learning structures. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I'm going in the right direction, but the last part of that question was just about student achievement.
Mm-hmm. The effectiveness, checking for the effectiveness of the instruction and that the students are actually achieving. Mm-hmm. Formative assessment. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I have a question. When you think about the term co-constructed learning, what does that look like?
Students showing evidence of being
facilitating, guiding, like students at the Great Hall.
I also think it involves more, if there's more than one teacher in the room, that all the instructors are participating.
It would certainly, to me, mean that the teacher's voice is not being heard.
Dominating, it's not dominating.
Right, that the majority of the time, you're hearing student voice.
Well, it's like active listening, because you repeat back, like my students say an answer, I repeat what I heard for clarification that what they said to me and what I'm getting ready to write down is actually their voice. Because I do have a tendency to want to teacher spin it, but I try to make sure I don't teacher spin it, or they'll say, oh no, yeah, add that to the end of it. They'll agree with whatever teacher spin I have. But I always measure co-construction. I numerically count off on my hand, and in order for me to feel that an idea has been completely co-constructed, I have to hear from 5 different students. Because as I've grown as a teacher, I realized that I was relying on those 3 quick kids all the time. And I always make sure that I'm hearing from a variety of kids. For true co-construction, I want to hear from all the viewpoints that I can. So I actually, it's like a habit. When I'm going through something, I'm always like, I count it off, and they'll go, why are you counting? And, sometimes they'll catch me counting, because I actually am putting up fingers as I go. And I'm like, I'm seeing how many answers I can get. And they like that. But I think it makes them feel comforted that their voice is heard. And that I'm encouraging variety of voices, and I'm trying to keep it open dialogue so that no one feels like they're going to be wrong per se. But when we come to a consensus, theirs may not be the major part of the consensus.
I think back to the question that you asked us yesterday about what is the most important job of a teacher. And several of us said facilitating learning and really having that partnership with the students. And I think that co-construction helps us actually do that. We have a means for really being a facilitator.
Part of the last couple of years, I've gone and you facilitate when I was in Culpeper watching teachers, but I visited other schools as well, and I said, I would like to see co-construction of learning. Many times when I observed, it was co-construction as a review. It had already been taught, it had already been covered. Now co-construction was, what did we learn? What were the key points? It wasn't really co-constructed learning, it was soliciting a review of presented information. And I think there's a tension there in when we first present information, what's the balance between what a teacher does and what the processing that students do. I saw, in the places where I saw co-construction best implemented, were classes where with underachieving students, students with learning disabilities, students with problems, where here was the text, they read it for the first time together, and then the teacher stood back and said, so what is this about? What should we write here? What would be the first thing? What does it require us to think about? And students would then suggest things, and they would propose things. And so the teacher would write these things down, say, so which of these things are right? What would you agree upon? What should we put as the result here? We've got 3 or 4 nominations. And then the students would say, well, and they would have a discussion about it, and then they would decide, and then the teacher would weigh in, well, what about this? And then they would create sort of a summary statement with some proof that that was the idea or the content. Now, some teachers would say, oh, that takes so much time. I'm going to tell them, here are the 3 points. Now we're going to look and try to justify it, but I need to move this. I need to move quicker. But for teachers who were teaching struggling, low-achieving kids who had to model the process of digesting, taking apart information, thinking about it, and coming up with that, what did we learn? teachers, I found that we had kids who they struggled with, that was the method that they really used to reach kids. And I think that we need to think about that. What is it that's really co-constructed learning with diverse groups of students? What does it look like? What is the role of teachers in presenting information and making sure, moving the class along? And then at what points do we really promote this thorough exploration, discussion, decision-making about, so what's the point?
I will tell you that from someone who has been at an alternative high school for 21 years, I felt like a lot of co-construction of new material. Not because I was magical or because I was a great teacher. I started doing it out of sheer survival, because when you're working with some of those students, one day I was having a lot of discipline, classroom management issues. When I was a new teacher, I started my third year at that school, and I just decided to take the kids, and if you're going to give me issues, be in charge. You want to be in charge. And my behavior issues went dramatically down. And it started from there. And when you put the kids in charge, the behavior issues go down to almost non-existent. And it's phenomenal. And when you when you say to the kids, okay, this is it. You're running the class, and you're going to be responsible for doing this. It works. You have very, 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 very few classroom management issues, and I think that's something that if teachers would understand that when teachers say it takes too much time, it doesn't take too much time, because then you're not dealing with some of those other issues that take away some of your other time. It
can balance out then.
It all balances out, and it all balances out. It works very well, and the kids get so much more engaged. And when they get engaged, you find that you are able to move through the material much faster than you normally would. And all of a sudden, you're like, oh, what do you mean a 90-minute block is over? I mean, truly that I think, if teachers realize that.
Yeah, over time, I think that when you first start something, it's harder and it does take longer. And so not only do the students get better, you're getting better as a teacher, and it becomes more efficient, and you're actually then focusing on the critical content. So when you're spending extra time on something, you've already predetermined that it was critical enough, it was worth it. And then you speed up.
That skill. I mean, I wasn't, when it first started, I was not finding it started by doing any kind of co-construction thing. It was, I was doing, okay, you're in charge of the review of what we did, kind of thing. And it certainly built from there, certainly as my experiences and my teaching skill grew.
Well, some of the words that I pulled out that are also on your cliff notes that I want under Teach Strategically, I wanted to make evident. We definitely have partnership learning. Kendall said voice. That actual partnership as a facilitator. The interactive dialogue then is a part of the classroom. We didn't talk about this keyword, explicit instruction, and that really is a part of Teaching Strategically, because when you look at some of the other questions that are on the Working Smarter, Not Harder document, it involves modeling for students and allowing them that time to practice and have feedback, and that's a part of Teaching Strategically, and those are some of the components that are essential to explicit instruction. And then cue, do, review. So when we look at smarter planning, when you get to this point, to stop and think about here, just to emphasize having cue, do, review, these the Smarter Planning process and QD review, they go with all of the content enhancement routines. And so having this as a go-to of this is overarching, it's integrated, it's a part of when you're using any of the routines. So when we look at where is the art of teaching represented on the course organizer, I wanted to point out a couple places where then when you're in that process of teaching and the students are learning and you want to document their progress, then they can go to their course map. And then they also see how you have your course standards broken down into the content and the process of learning. Another connection would be how you set up, how are we going to learn all of the concepts that are in these units? So we're going to have a lot of learning rituals that represent, these learning rituals will help us with the difficulties that we've identified when we analyze for learning difficulties. And our performance options are also a part of reaching enhancement decisions that will work, that some students will select to improve their learning experience. And teaching strategically, coming back to the course and unit organizer and that process within using each routine. So on your unit organizer, when you're analyzing for the difficulties of the content and potentially why is this unit, why are those questions going to be hard to answer, those are represented by your unit relationships. And then when you've thought about that, you can start to determine you're reaching your enhancement decisions. That's going to help with building your schedule. So that's where, and teaching strategically fits with your unit organizer. Okay, so we're going to look at evaluate learning. And so when you think about this, now we can bring in formative assessment. And these are some of the reflective questions that are on the guide. Working smarter, not harder. And I just pulled out some of them because you're looking for, is my instruction working? Are my assessments working? Am I going to modify my teaching? When we think about a person who's researching a lot about formative assessment, Dylan William, saying, and Dana maybe can help me with what the quote was that we looked up, but it was, you don't have to look it up again, we're going to paraphrase it. But he was saying that if your assessment doesn't lead to a change in your instruction, the information that's then shared with students, that feedback to students, then it's not really a formative assessment. So I think evaluate the learning process is a good, it's a good guide to make sure that we're doing that. And then do I need to is the starter for several questions on your guide to ask yourself. And going back to your critical question, how well can they answer that question? So when we look at, well, don't wait until the end of the unit to gain insights about learning. I really found that something very powerful because early on in my teaching career, I did have some surprises when I gave the unit test. And I thought, gosh, if I were doing a better job with formative assessment, I wouldn't be surprised. I would know if they were ready and if I needed to do reteaching with students before they took a summative assessment. So formative assessment, this is the definition in your glossary. And so we're going to look at, and I'm going to cue it, and we're going to do it, and we're going to review it. We're going to watch a video, and this is actually Rick Wormley, and he has a lot of very quick videos on YouTube, and you know, he packs a lot of information in a real succinct way. So when he talks about formative assessment, think about how it impacts the lesson planning process. When you're listening, that can be something you can think about. And then also think about the difference then between summative and formative assessment while you're listening. Okay.
One of the things that comes up when you get into a differentiated class, let alone one that's standards-based, is you have to begin to weigh formative versus summative assessment. Now, summative assessment is actually anticlimactic. It really refers to post-learning, after all is said and done. So the final declaration, usually there's not a lot of capacity to go back and revise one's efforts and be assessed and accredited anew. But one thing that teachers forget is that something that was intended to be summative, child does poorly for whatever reason, You're allowed to make it a formative assessment. Something that was summative now becomes formative. That's actually okay, it's within your prerogative. But what about formative assessment? Well, of the two, teachers tend to spend the majority of their time designing their summative assessments, as if that was the most important aspect. But really, it's formative assessment. That's the most important aspect. It is the greatest impact on student achievement, on feedback to the teacher, everything. The whole enterprise of teaching and learning really boils down to that formative assessment. Can kids learn without grades? Yeah. Can they learn without formative assessment and the feedback that comes from it? Not at all. So we want to emphasize that. In fact, I would suggest that teachers spend at least the same amount of time, if not more, designing formative assessment instead of summative assessment. But what is this formative assessment? Well, formative assessment obviously is the ongoing assessment, is the checkpoints along the way. But here's the kicker. The best formative assessment actually involves descriptive feedback. Not just, hey, thank you for finishing on time. No, it was you had your supplies, you were able to do this and this and this, and that helps all of us. It's kind of like Jim Fay in his Love and Logic books, Point and Describe. The National Association of Secondary School Principals and many other folks who are into assessment talk about three aspects of descriptive feedback. You help the kid discover, or you point it out yourself, what was the goal, what was the original intent, the objective, where are you in relation to it, and what are we going to do to close that gap? Three different parts of good descriptive feedback. When a kid can take that and use it, we find that formative assessment is any assessment that's done where the kid is allowed to revise his efforts in light of that feedback and then be assessed and accredited anew. Perhaps there's some relearning in there as well, but it's ongoing, and that's the focus. If our focus is summative assessment, students don't learn as well. Dylan William, one of the great researchers in this, he did this wonderful manifesto, Inside the Black Box, with Paul Black. And man, it turned America on its ear. In 1998, we started looking at formative assessment and started transforming schools. So how do we give feedback to kids? Is there formative assessment in my lesson plans? In great lessons, I should be able to circle the formal formative assessment and feedback going to students. There's also informal, where you observe, maybe get some feedback right there in the spur of the moment. But I should see lots of checks for understanding and kids getting that feedback. In fact, Bob Marzano and many others talk about the effect size, the impact of some decision. And it turns out the effect is much greater if you do an assessment and there's going to be descriptive feedback. If there's no feedback, it turns out the assessment, the tasks, the assignments don't have much instructional value compared to when there's feedback. So in the same planning breath, as I design my assessment, I'm going to design how will students get feedback on this, and how will it inform my lessons. In fact, I should be able to walk down a hallway, stop a teacher cold. They don't know I'm coming. They don't know the question's coming. And say, how did formative assessment inform one of your decisions today or this week with a student, a subset of students, or a class? And the teacher should feel very comfortable. I found out this about these students. I decided to do that. That's one of the big pillars of differentiated instruction. And it turns out classes where teachers focus on formative assessment, test scores go up if you use that as an indicator. But really, mastery, student achievement, it all goes up. And again, I wonder, what goes unlearned because a teacher didn't get into, didn't understand, didn't apply formative assessment principles?
So did you hear him repeat something a lot? Did you hear some repetition in what he was saying? What would you say some of his main points were? Formative assessment. Descriptive feedback. Yes, he definitely talked about the importance of that being one of the responses when you give that. I think sometimes formative assessment can be misunderstood for the actual tool that you're using, and to think more about it as that process, like what happens afterwards, after you've given that assessment for the teachers and the students. Keith?
One of the interventions in SIM that's really not usually included with our content enhancement routines is the Learning Expressways folder. How many of you have heard of that? Okay. The Learning Expressways folder, for those of you who haven't heard about it, it's a folder where the teacher puts in a page, and at the end of the lesson asks the students for feedback. begin a conversation about instruction. And it could be how we're learning today. It could be a teacher poses a question. And when the teacher then takes these folders and goes through all the student responses, some of the responses have individual student feedback to the teacher. It has some information, I didn't understand X. It could be that you find out as you read through these responses, half of my class didn't get this. And what's helpful about that process is that in the informal manual, that's just you have to kind of ask for it. We say the next day, or the next time, you do some group feedback about half of you had trouble with this, so we're going to spend some more time on it. But then there's individual feedback for individuals who only that person didn't get it, and you might say, see me when, or see me about this. So I think that the whole idea of what he's talking about here, there are lots of ways to do it in addition to explicitly asking the kids for feedback about your teaching, about how learning's going, about things you didn't get. That can be then done as both group and informal kind of conversations. And the research on that, what we found is that when teachers ask for feedback or get information, and the students see the teacher changing their teaching because of that, that builds trust. That builds more confidence in the teacher, and the students become more willing to give accurate information, and we're willing to expect that teacher to care about them and to do things on their behalf. Teachers who don't give feedback, who don't change their instruction in the face of kids repeatedly saying, this isn't working for me, or I don't get that, begin to lose teacher trust, and that teacher moves out of that quality window of what a good teacher really is. And I think that this kind of fits into this whole conversation about this ongoing evaluation of building trust, but that's about responding to feedback and responding to the information the kids give you.
Well, we saw yesterday when we looked at effect size, that student teacher trust is very high, it's very high.
And I think in that particular course, a student could then, they would decrease their motivation over time. It would get worse and worse and worse if they haven't had a response from their teacher. Well, when we look at the glossary tomorrow morning, let's look, he mentioned the 3 key points of descriptive feedback, and there are some additional key points there, but let's save that as a reflection and read that tomorrow. This is something that he talked about, how you can take a summative assessment and make it a formative assessment, and I really wanted us to kind of question that for a minute. Once you put in, there's other research that's saying, though, once you put a numerical score on an assessment, students don't see the comments for growth. So what are the possible solutions for this? So if you think about, you've given a quiz and you are planning on adjusting your instruction, you are planning on giving feedback, but traditionally when you give a quiz, you go ahead and put a grade on it. Is that a missed learning opportunity then? If they're not going to see that, they're not going to necessarily listen even to what that feedback is. If they see it as a done deal, they already have that grade that's been recorded in the grade book. So what do you think some solutions might be? This could be like logistical solutions too.
When I do, at the end of class, I do a quiz, and I usually call it a frame quiz, because generally they're framed, they're allowed to use during the quiz in order to pull the information out. But I always tell them I'm going to give them it back the next day. And on kids that don't do well, I tell them they have to reach 80%, and then I put it in the grade book, and it's done. But if they don't, I give it back to them the next day. And I don't have the score, I just have the X's.
Okay.
And so they know which ones they've missed, and then we talk about as a class, those of you that had trouble, tended to have trouble on this or this, and we revisit it on the frame, make sure, okay, did we get everything on there? Is it not clear what we were talking about? And then they are given the quiz again.
To have a chance to adjust themselves and show that they've learned
I
it.
don't think I had any ever not reach 80% on the second go-around after words. And the other kids were given a separate warm-up while they did that, so it was allowing the two portions to do that.
Any other solutions?
Maybe creating like a checklist of some sort where whatever each question addressed, we just put it across the top and the students' names are down the side, and it's really more of a checklist for you, so if they mastered, all these questions, check it off, and then allow those students, do a small group instruction.
So then they're having their feedback, but you know how their performance was.
Right, so you're not actually giving them the assessment, and then maybe later on, when they retake the assessment, then you can attach it or something and show them how much they've grown.
You can even have two strips on what you're saying, like have a strip at the top on how they felt they did on the, like it could be a quiz even or something, and at the top, what they think they got. And then you could put the actual number missed. You know what I mean? Like they feel like they mastered it. It could be even non-numerical. I mastered this. I kind of got it. I have no idea what I was doing. I'm a really good guesser or whatever it is. And then you can, put your comment. Yes, you mastered it. Check smiley face. You still need a little work. Or yes, you're not as good a guesser as you thought. We need to go over this again. See me then. Something like that.
So try to take the evaluative part
Well,
out of
the
it,
self-goal
though. Yeah.
setting too, that is high on the learning.
Any student in my class, regardless of the score, on any assignment, could see before remediation. We have, we've called it a million things over the last year, so whatever you want to call it, time, whatever, you kind of have to go. They could come see me for remediation on anything. I don't care what the score was. I don't care if you got 94 and you wanted 100, or you got a 20 and you wanted to pass.
So in that case, it's more about the culture that you're trying to decrease the emphasis that a score would even matter because
Scores don't matter.
you will be able to retake.
Anybody could see me for any remediation on anything, and you can come and review any assignment with me after remediation with me. You had to come see me for remediation. It wasn't you just got to retake it. So it wasn't like,
Right.
right.
Okay.
I had a bad situation with that. When I put that out there as the culture in my classroom one year, I had kids that just did not prepare for the test, and they were like, "Man, I'll just come see you later about
Oh,
this."
sorry, but that.
And they would do it. They would just bomb it.
But that was, like, you couldn't sleep, we had, there were stipulations, you couldn't sleep, kind of thing, you couldn't
Yeah,
sleep.
well, they didn't sleep. They just didn't prepare. They just went home and didn't care about what I had taught. Didn't care about stuff. So I mean, I wonder. I mean, I'm not going to talk.
And I think one year I had that,
culture.
and so one year we had to change the culture to, you had to have a minimum score, I think you had to have a minimum score of 50. If anything below a 50, you only got to take those twice that year, and the other kids came up with that. We had,
Set some ground rules.
we had to say something, but I made the kids
Yeah.
come up with it. I said, look, guys, this is what's happening. We need to sit down and decide, because I did have that happen one year, and and I'm just telling you, if you put things out to the kids are way harsher to
Yeah.
each other than you're ever gonna be, and they're like, don't let them ever take it. No, okay, wait, now time out. No,
Yeah.
suspend them all. No, kind of thing. But yeah, you let the kids decide.
As you move into the role of professional developer, I can tell that the people who are here think about this. Figure out how can we do formative assessment, how do we deal with summative assessments, what do we do with the scores, but the problem you're going to face is a mindset that does not include some of the thinking and the reflections that I just heard. The mindset of a lot of teachers, and when we ask teachers, when do you decide that you don't reteach but you're going to move on? And their criteria that teachers told us, and we asked this across many different high schools, 50% of the kids get 50% of the content. Then that's good enough to move on. It didn't make any difference if the 50% that they didn't get really was the critical stuff or not. It was just a score that says, okay, 50% of the kids got 50% of it, I can move on. And that mindset, and on this white paper that I gave Jocelyn, we talk about mindset as a major barrier for the success of our professional development, which means mindsets like, I don't have time for co-creation. I don't have time to go back and reteach. These mindsets are the things that undermine the work we do. And more of our time needs to be spent thinking about how do we develop what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. The willingness to revisit what some of my beliefs about teaching, assessment, assignments, change, all of that, and engage teachers in things that will shift them to reconsider practices like, what about a kid who gets Fs on the first 4 or 5 assignments, and then you begin working with them, and they move from to a D, and then to a C, and to a B, the end of the semester? Do you average all those grades and they get an F still?
I have heard teachers say yes to that question, and
I've had
it's
teachers
heartbreaking.
say, yes, yes. And they says, but I reflected effort, I gave them an A. But you still give them an F in content. Do you think they're going to continue in that class if they're failing it? Now they got to redo it. So what about this concept of forgiveness as a community principle? The idea that you, at that point, you can reinvent yourself. So, revisiting some of these concepts about what do we do in certain situations and how we create that culture in our classroom. More time, I think, needs to be given to this. We're never going to be able to create collaborative, co-constructed learning if the mindset is teacher-centered instruction is what's important at a secondary school. We are beating our heads against the wall. We are the mindset is, I can't use technology. If we're moving that way, you're not going to get that teacher to be able to use interactive technology. If we want them to begin to rethink their assessments, but they have certain belief systems about that, and they're dead set, we're going to have problems. So, what could shift that? And there are methods, there are ways to help teachers develop a growth mindset. And I think that's part of the huge challenge that you're going to face as a professional developer. That we can't go in with just implementing our practice with other practices in a coexisting manner and expect ours to be sustained when they love theirs. And when we go away, then the practices they've always used begin to seep back in as the primary way that they teach. So I think those underlying principles become really important as you begin not only preparing for, I'm going to provide professional development in the quality assignment routine, but what mindsets am I up against here that I've got to really address?
And a quote here really represents that, a different mindset that connects really well with Pat Cross. She wrote this. Go ahead and read that statement. And I think just even as a practical way to persuade someone, if you were to share this, is a waste of your energy or your breath. Then, if you're going to keep going forward and just keep covering curriculum, and on the receiving end they're not with you, why keep moving forward on and on and on if there's no learning on the other end of it that's taken place? So. Actually going to look to, let's see, with the R step, because we need to be able to kind of end our smarter portion and get into the next section, but I don't want to totally just drop it at the end, so I'm going to try to move to R, and then we'll do a wrap up. So we have looking back, and I think we've kind of gotten the idea behind this of going back and revisiting, and that being a part of that formative assessment process and reflective teaching practices. So this question is something just to think about. For formative assessment to have an impact on student achievement, do teachers have to plan intentional assessments and the responses to the results? I think this comes about because sometimes when you start talking about formative assessment, you'll hear, well, I'm checking for understanding constantly. I'm always checking. I'm always looking over their shoulders and walking around circulating. And so I do it already, I guess, is saying not really having that change of mindset of even improving in their own practice and self-check. Can I do a better job of actually intentionally planning formative assessment, or even just using the results of the informal formative assessments through checks? So we're actually not going to turn to our partner. You have the E and R when they're recording their progress on their progress chart is a part of where it is reflected. And then also, when you think about the learning rituals, if formative assessment providing feedback to your students, that's a learning ritual in your classroom, that would be reflected here. Also, I love that community principal comment about forgiveness, and maybe that it does impact the way you're using those E and R steps in your classroom does impact your community principals. And the performance options that are available for students, like what Jennifer, you were talking about, being able to come back, relearn the content, remediate, and then retest. So with your answering the self-test questions, looking back at those questions, revisiting them, that comes into play here. Are they successfully learning the relationships and being able to actually have a conversation about the knowledge that they have in that unit? This is something, Winnie Morawski, who presents on co-teaching practices, has she talks about when you sit down and you want to have efficient planning process in place with your co-planning, because there's not enough time, there's not enough common planning available in the schedule. I really think that smarter planning could help be a part of that process. And so if you look at what Winnie Morawski says is to talk about the what first, then how are we going to teach it, and who do we have to make sure that we're paying special attention to based on their learning needs. This process can really fit very nicely with looking at our critical questions, our content, and then together really hashing out what's going to be difficult, what are our enhancement decisions, which co-teaching approaches will we be using with those enhancement decisions, and teach strategically. That's got to be your how. And then who, when you're applying your formative assessment and you're thinking about readjusting your learning, you're going back through your cycle and you're doing this together as a team. So I just wanted to bring that idea up front. So for our post organizer, you have your note sheet, but you also have a tic-tac-toe. So this is going to be very fast-paced. It's going to be a review of what the last hour, it's an hour and a half that we have spent talking about the smarter planning process. So with a partner, you're going to play tic-tac-toe. And so you're going to decide who's O, who's X, answer the question on the square that you would like to take, and then after you've answered it, you'll put your X or your O, and you'll go just take turns with tic-tac-toe, okay? Go ahead.
You want to go first? I know, right? Oh, myself.
Always start.
I'm going to try the middle. Okay. I'm going to go like this on the front, okay?
Analyze.
What's so clear? I am. Oh, shape the questions. Shape the question. The second one oh, like what they're going to have trouble with. Yeah.
It totally works.
Yes.
Totally.
Standards.
I mean, it does take a lot of time.
And other curriculum guidelines or resource
what does it mean to teach strategically? Choosing, have a variety.
So, I'm gonna get to this one because that's
Well, can it fit with one of our questions here? This? How about 2? Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, that's very good. You're, yeah, because that would be the application.
So can you ask, go ahead and ask it there?
Oh, which one, just one of these steps, they're all what resources can help you shape
The standards, right?
That's true too.
Help you shape the critical questions within each other, like, and lesson, you know, because like lesson leads to unit, unit leads to course.
So, like, I'm sorry,
And
I
then
don't understand
I would
Bob's
say
question
police.
because I even put on here, like, I even put on here, like, here's the ART part.
Are you on the bottom left trying to get yours? Okay.
That's very open.
Oh, it is? So
Oh, yeah, it totally is. I mean, that is correct, because then it's going to help you, like, guide you in your developing, when you're actually developing your unit and course organizers, then you can use the S and M to guide those questions. I mean, throughout, the whole time you're developing those, both of those
Oh, so it's, I
devices.
get it now, we apply the, so we do the
analyze
the critical and map when we're.
When you're doing your questions on your course and unit organizer,
We
yeah.
do the analyze relationships, when we're looking at
Yes.
when we're looking at our students and what may be difficult for them. We're looking at our,
The shaping questions obviously is the
the
questions.
enhancement when we're looking at our individual,
R,
discipline that we're
R
looking at for
and
that.
T are
What
in your
might be the
schedule.
barriers or what.
I think it's kind of the thinking, well, you, as a short answer, could be the thinking process that's behind the development of both of those routines.
Principles on the course organizer.
Wait, it's already.
listed enough, so,
E,
well, I was kind of evaluating data.
so it goes, R and T are scheduled, and E and R are community principles on the course organizer. You could even do it as
Looks like we've got some tic-tac-toe masters in here, because you're going to end up covering all of the squares. You have it electronically.
I know, and we know that.
And let's see, this is instruction, form instruction.
Okay.
Review, what we put there. I think that implementing the smart planning process to address the whole range of critical planning, wrap around process.
Or would it also be evaluate for mastery? Some of your combination, do I need to reteach any?
All right, I'm going to call it quits. Did anybody actually win a game of tic-tac-toe out there? Because you both won. Well, that's what's happening over here, is they're just blocking each other's moves. So it's going to be, no one's going to win, actually. Okay, so let's look at our last 3 questions that you took some notes on. And we're just going to highlight a few points for each one. So the first question, how can smarter planning support various curriculum planning needs? What were some of the thoughts that you had on that? So you're trying to make connections to situations that you might find yourself in, or different stakeholders who you might be talking to, and you think, oh, you know what? I think I can talk about smarter planning right now. What would it fit with? Kendall?
I think even unpacking the standards, just getting teachers started with digging into their curriculum framework. Things they have to do have to be able to map that critical content.
Yeah. And you could hear somebody say those words, unpacking the standards. You hear it all the time. So you go, oh, I've got a technique for that. Rachel? You gonna say one?
That was mine.
That was yours,
I wrote
okay.
Deep, unpack SOL in mind and change the questions.
Mm-hmm. Good ones. Supporting that co-teaching process was one of the ones that I had shared, yeah. Mhm. How about helping teachers think about integration? How could smarter planning help with that? I don't know when to use a frame. That's such a great tool, but when am I going to use it? Concept comparison. Okay, all right, when am I going to use concept comparison?
It's the art of it. The art of teaching.
Yeah.
And truly understanding the different tools in your toolbox so that you do know when to pull out each of them to address whatever concept you're teaching about.
I'm planting the seed for the flowers to grow this afternoon with Dana and Kendall on that question. So you can think about that.
And Keith, could you talk about to the group the importance of the expanded map? Because what we see a lot of times when we go into buildings, teachers, for whatever reason, I think maybe it's lack of understanding, crunch for time, they don't use that expanded map. So you can't get to the critical content and how you're going to teach that. So you never get to integration. And then it makes us wonder, how are you going to have the students apply their understanding to those critical questions? It's the expanded map in my mind is like the application piece of those questions and those unit relationships, how they're going to demonstrate their understanding. We're going to delve deeper, yes.
Well, I mean, I think you captured, many of the reasons why it's important. The design of the unit organizer was, the first page is at the very beginning of the unit to cast the big picture. But then as we teach the unit, the expanded unit map is the central part of the collaborative co-construction learning experience. It is where we say, all right, at the beginning of the unit we said we were going to cover this. So let's read a little bit and make some decisions about what we're going to create as what's important about this. And so that expanded unit map is our record of creation. It's the record of conversation. It's the record of exploration. It's the record of which we use kids to ask questions, to do self-questioning, to do paraphrasing, to do summarizing. So it is the central part of creating that collaborative, co-constructed learning experience. And if you don't have that, then kids will tell you that teacher's not a very effective teacher. They don't use the unit organizer correctly. And when we did interviews with kids, they knew the teachers who were good, and they knew the teachers who were bad. And I asked them, I said, could you teach a teacher how to use the unit organizer correctly? And say, you bet, you let me at them. Because they knew they could compare teachers who were using it well and who were using it not well. The teachers who were using it well, they could say, and I get better grades because the teacher uses it this way, and I see an improvement in my grades. I wish all my teachers used it that way. So, I mean, when you begin to hear it from kids about how a unit organizer is used correctly versus teachers who are not, you begin to get a sense that there's something going on here that we need to listen to and pay attention to, as opposed to our own teacher preference for how we interpret the intervention or how it should be used. So I would really say that's the whole purpose, and kids know it.
I'm so glad you did these interviews.
I know.
Me
too. How is formative assessment included in the smarter planning process? I think that really builds right off of some of the comments that were just made here with that conversation. So any other notes that you took on formative assessment being a part of smarter planning?
That helps you to teach strategically.
Evaluate for mastery.
Okay. And that the cyclical piece of teaching. Okay. And then what's new about smarter planning? If you had some experience already with smarter planning, what were some of your observations that was new?
assignment piece was always.
Right
Yeah,
now,
we've made it very explicit.
yes, yep.
And I think, planning for the assessments up front and throughout, when you're thinking about smarter. Just bringing that to the forefront.
Yes. I think the other part, and Keith emphasized it verbally with us, about looking at the relationships and having those on the map. And so now the map is not just mapping the critical content, but and relationships, and making sure that that's a part of it. I really appreciate that, because then you're not going to leave off your line labels. You're going to help students to see the relationships.
You know, the travesty with implementing smarter planning is changing your teaching, but not changing your test. Because when you shift your emphasis to the ideas and the higher order reasoning, that means you need to have items on your assessment that reflect what you're teaching. And I've watched teachers change their teaching that use the same tests that they've used in the past, and the kids don't do well. And then they begin to say, well, this kind of instruction is not working. Well, it's because they haven't aligned their assessment with what they're teaching. So that becomes the aha that, oh boy, now I've got to change this, and now I've got to change my course, and so it begins that process, which is kind of a dangerous process to begin, because then it creates a lot of work. But it is that journey that really is important to make that mindset shift, these ahas.
One thing with the student performance by question, I am glad that the state has decided to take that step and let teachers know what types of questions are the students missing. Are they low level? Are they high level? I mean, that really allows you to hone in to change your instruction.
Yeah,
if
and
needed.
to build items that resemble those items on the assessments into classroom tasks and assignments, so they get used to it.
All right, well, thank you for this portion. I guess we need to take a short break, and then would you think we could do like just a 5-minute break?
Yes.
Run to the
I'm hoping we
restroom,
can do a 5-minute
we'll set
break,
up.
Run to the restroom, because lunch will be served shortly, and I just want to speak with you too.
Okay.
about the time thing.
Okay,
Okay?
sounds good.
And also, anything, and I've seen lots of people doing it, be sure you're journaling your ideas and thoughts as you've gone through this meeting.
I know.
It is 10:12. The big time frame is 1 o'clock. Montgomery County, the team's coming here, and we have lunch. So, we can do it a couple ways. We can, at 5 come back together, and you can start. We can have a working lunch. We can stop and have lunch and come back. What are you thinking?
I'm not thinking, I'm okay with any of the above. I mean, working lunch is fine. I mean, I don't care.
Well, my main purpose also is for you to get nutrition, because you've got, you'll be involved in the meeting at 1. So,
The good thing, the lunches should be boxed.
Yeah.
They're based on,
Right.
so it'll be
Oh,
easy
good.
to
Right.
move them around,
And
because
to
it's
bring
coming
them
from
in here.
here.
Well,
So-
I'm thinking we so that, because our group really likes to be able to talk and ask questions and interact, so I'm thinking working lunch, and then we maybe just have 10 minutes of that, or more if you need it, so that you actually can
So
eat
everybody
first.
can just
Everyone
get
can get what they
started.
need, get their lunch started.